she whispered in the quiet of my friend's house. "If you leave now, you'll regret it forever." And just like that, everything changed. The evening started like any other, casual and unremarkable. I had stopped by my best friend's house after work, expecting the usual banter, the hum of background TV, and the faint smell of his mom's cooking lingering somewhere between the kitchen and the living room. But tonight, something felt different, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the air had shifted in the half-light of the living room. My friend was distracted by his phone, caught up in some conversation I didn't need to hear. That left me alone with her, his mom. She was sitting on the couch, a soft lamp casting a golden glow over her features. She moved with a quiet grace, like she belonged to some slower, more deliberate rhythm of the world. Her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, catching the light in a way that made it look almost iridescent. And she smelled faintly of vanilla and something warmer, something uniquely her own, that made the space feel intimate, though it was just a living room. I didn't know why I noticed all these details. Her laughter as she commented on my friend's antics, the way she brushed a stray hair behind her ear, the gentle tilt of her head when she spoke. But I did. There was a calm confidence in her that made ordinary actions feel significant. Even the way she reached for a photo frame on the mantel, fingers brushing the glass lightly, seemed to hold a story I wasn't yet allowed to read. "Hey," she said, glancing at me with a smile that was both warm and knowing. Her voice had a softness that made the room feel smaller, closer. "You've grown taller since the last time I saw you. Or maybe I just wasn't paying attention." I laughed, a little awkwardly, but I felt the warmth of her eyes on me as I did. There was an unspoken playfulness there, something almost teasing, yet gentle, like she knew she was pulling me into a quiet game, and I didn't even realize it. A pause hung in the air, filled with nothing but the soft ticking of a clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator. And in that pause, something shifted. I felt it as a subtle pull, not physical exactly, but emotional. A curious awareness of her presence that made my chest tighten just slightly. My friend was still occupied, completely unaware that the atmosphere in the room had changed. She reached for a cup of tea, and our hands brushed. Just a fleeting touch, barely there, but enough to send a tiny jolt through me. I wasn't sure if she noticed, or if she did, whether she meant to, but my mind stuttered in the silence that followed. It was then that I realized this wasn't just my friend's mom anymore. She was someone who could hold a room in her quiet, someone whose presence demanded attention without a single word of command. And in the small, unremarkable moments of that evening, the way she moved, the way she smiled, the brief brush of her fingers against mine, I felt the first stirrings of something I couldn't yet name. By the time my friend finally turned back from his phone, I was aware of every subtle detail. The warmth in the room, the calmness in her posture, and the quiet, magnetic pull that made leaving suddenly feel impossible. The evening lingered on, quiet but charged in a way I didn't fully understand. My friend had disappeared into his room, leaving me alone again with her. I offered to help with the dishes, something small, innocent enough to justify lingering. But it felt like an excuse to stay near her, to watch her move through the kitchen with that quiet elegance I couldn't stop noticing. She was humming softly, a tune I didn't recognize, and it clung to the air like smoke, warm and faint, drawing me closer without a word. I washed the first plate mechanically, but my attention kept drifting to her. The subtle arch of her back as she reached for a spice jar, the way her fingers lingered on the countertop, the small crease in her forehead when she concentrated. I wanted to tell her that I noticed, that I appreciated these little glimpses into her world, but the words caught in my throat. "You're quieter than usual tonight," she said suddenly, without turning around. Her voice was soft but observant, as if she could see straight through the surface of me. "I guess. I'm just tired," I replied, unsure why my voice sounded different around her, slightly hesitant, almost nervous. She tilted her head, letting me meet her gaze. There was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes, but also warmth, like she wanted to reach out without overstepping. For a moment, the kitchen felt smaller, more intimate, the ordinary act of washing dishes becoming something extraordinary. "I know how that feels," she said softly, her tone carrying a quiet empathy. "Some days just weigh on you more than others." I nodded, silently grateful for the acknowledgement. There was a sincerity in her words that made me want to tell her everything I was thinking, the small anxieties, the hidden doubts. But instead, I let the silence speak. And in that silence, something subtle happened. Our hands brushed briefly as we reached for the same dish towel. The touch was light, fleeting, but it lingered in my mind longer than it should have. Her skin was warm, reassuring, almost grounding. I felt a sudden urge to speak, to break the tension, but the words felt heavy. Instead, I found myself simply listening to the soft rhythm of her movements, to the faint sound of her breathing, to the calm steadiness she radiated even in such an ordinary moment. It was intoxicating in a way I couldn't define. "You know," she continued, softer now, almost in a whisper, "sometimes it helps to just have someone notice you. Even the little things." Her hand paused on a plate, fingers brushing the rim lightly. There was a depth to her gaze that made my chest tighten, a silent invitation to connect without words. I nodded again, feeling a quiet shift inside me. It wasn't just admiration anymore. It was something warmer, heavier, yet entirely subtle. For the first time, I sensed that she noticed me too, not just as her son's friend, but as someone capable of understanding her, of seeing the person behind the poised, graceful exterior. By the time the dishes were done, the air between us had changed. It was no longer just casual conversation. It was a quiet acknowledgement of something unspoken, a gentle thread of connection that neither of us could, or would, ignore. And as I handed her the last plate, our fingers touched again, lingering a moment longer than necessary, a silent promise of more to come. The evening had grown quiet, the kind of stillness that makes even small sounds seem magnified. My friend had retreated to his room for some late-night assignment, leaving the house bathed in the soft glow of lamps and the faint hum of a ceiling fan. I stood by the doorway, about to leave, feeling an unusual weight in my chest that I couldn't quite name. She appeared from the kitchen, carrying a cup of tea. Her movement was fluid, effortless, yet there was a tension in her posture I hadn't noticed before. As she approached, the warm scent of her perfume, soft vanilla, a hint of jasmine, reached me. It was familiar now, almost comforting, but tonight it carried a subtle undertone of something more. "You're leaving already?" Her voice was low, melodic, and softer than usual. She stepped closer, though still careful to maintain distance. But there was an unspoken gravity in the space between us, a magnetic pull that made me hesitate. "I should get going," I said, forcing a casual tone, though my pulse had quickened. I wanted to speak, to say something meaningful, but the words tangled in my throat. She stopped, just short of the doorway, and tilted her head slightly, eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my chest tighten. There was a pause, one that felt suspended in time, where the world shrank to the space between us. Then she leaned in just enough that her presence pressed closer than necessary, without touching, and whispered, "If you leave now, you'll regret it forever." Her words were soft, almost a secret shared in confidence, yet heavy with meaning. The warmth of her breath brushed against my ear, a subtle, intimate sensation that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. I froze, caught between instinct and reason, feeling a surge of emotion I didn't fully understand. It wasn't a command, nor was it flirtation in the usual sense. It was something more complex, an acknowledgement of the unspoken connection we'd been building, a pull towards something neither of us dared to name. My heart thudded in my chest, loud enough that I was sure she could hear it, and for a moment I couldn't think, couldn't move, could only feel. Her eyes searched mine, and I realized she wasn't just teasing or testing me. She was sharing a truth, fragile and urgent. The way she leaned slightly closer, the almost imperceptible tilt of her lips, the soft cadence of her voice, it all combined to make that single moment feel suspended, like the air itself had thickened. I wanted to speak, to respond with words that would bridge the distance between us, but all I could do was nod subtly, my throat tight, my hands almost trembling. In that quiet, dimly lit hallway, everything had shifted. I felt a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating, a magnetic pull that made leaving feel impossible and staying feel inevitable. By the time I finally stepped back, giving the illusion of casual departure, I carried with me a new awareness, a realization that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. That single whispered warning had altered the rhythm of our connection, leaving me both unsettled and intensely alive, anticipating every next glance, every next brush of hands, every unspoken word yet to come. The next time I visited, it wasn't planned. It was just a casual drop-by under the pretense of returning something my friend had left behind. But from the moment I stepped inside, the atmosphere felt charged, as if the house itself remembered the whisper from the last evening. She was in the living room, folding laundry, the soft hum of a song playing somewhere in the background. The warm light spilled over her, catching the strands of her hair as they tumbled over her shoulder, and for a moment, I forgot what I had come for. She glanced up, and our eyes met. Something unspoken passed between us in that brief instant, a flicker of recognition that lingered longer than it should have. She offered a small smile, warm but edged with curiosity, and it made my chest tighten, an invisible weight settling between us. There was a rhythm to the way we existed in the same space, unspoken and quiet, that made even ordinary actions feel deliberate, meaningful. "Here to return this?" she asked, her voice soft, almost teasing. "Yeah, thought I'd drop it off before it got lost in your house," I replied, fumbling slightly, aware of the way her gaze seemed to linger on me a moment longer than necessary. As I passed by her to place the item on the counter, our hands brushed. Just a fleeting touch, accidental by all appearances, but the warmth of her skin left a trace, an imprint I couldn't shake. I felt a subtle shiver, my pulse quickening, and caught myself stealing a glance at her. She didn't pull away. Instead, she held the contact for just a heartbeat longer, her eyes lifting to meet mine in that quiet acknowledgement that spoke volumes. We drifted into conversation, mundane at first, about the weather, about my friend, about small happenings in her day, but beneath the surface, every pause and glance carried weight. A tilt of her head, a brush of hair from her face, a soft laugh at something I said. All these gestures became charged with meaning. My words felt heavier, slower, more deliberate, because I was acutely aware of her presence and the magnetic pull of her attention. At one point, she moved toward the kitchen counter, reaching for a glass. Our hands brushed again, lingering for the briefest moment, enough that it felt deliberate without either of us acknowledging it outright. That moment, subtle as it was, tethered my attention entirely to her, leaving my mind scattered with thoughts I couldn't yet name. Even the silences between us were full of tension. The way her gaze would drift toward mine, then away, only to return, made my chest tighten. I realized she noticed the same things I did, my pauses, my small hesitations, my attentiveness, and perhaps she enjoyed them as much as I did. By the time I finally left, the house felt impossibly quiet, and I walked out with my mind replaying every glance, every brush of hands, every subtle tilt of her lips. The lingering tension was no longer just a fleeting feeling. It had grown roots, embedding itself in every thought I had about her. And I knew, with an almost painful clarity, that I was no longer visiting her home merely as my friend's guest. Something deeper, something entirely unspoken but undeniably real, had begun to take shape. The next afternoon arrived with a soft drizzle, the kind that makes the world feel smaller, more intimate, almost like the outside had paused to let time stretch. I had come over just to check in, an innocent excuse, but when I arrived, I found her sitting by the large front window, a cup of tea cradled between her hands, the rain tracing delicate patterns down the glass. The light was dim, filtered through gray clouds, and the gentle rhythm of the drops against the window pane filled the room, like a quiet soundtrack for the unspoken tension hovering between us. She looked up as I entered, her eyes holding a softness that made me pause mid-step. There was no pretense tonight, no playful teasing, just a raw, human vulnerability that pulled at something deep within me. "Come, sit," she said, gesturing toward the chair beside her. I obeyed, feeling the air thicken, charged with an intensity that neither of us had dared to acknowledge before. For a long while, we simply watched the rain, neither speaking. And then, slowly, she began to share pieces of herself. The quiet struggles, the frustrations with life, the subtle loneliness that often went unnoticed. She spoke not as a figure of authority, or as my friend's mom, but as a woman with a history, with hopes, fears, and regrets. Every word carried weight, yet she delivered them softly, almost hesitant, as if she were testing whether I could handle the truth beneath the polished surface. I listened, rapt, feeling a protective instinct stir within me. There was no judgment, no advice, just presence, just attention. And in that attention, something shifted. Our hands brushed as she adjusted her cup, and the warmth of her skin against mine was grounding, intimate, yet entirely innocent. I felt the steadiness of her heartbeat through the slight pressure of her fingers, and it struck me how much comfort there was in simply being near her. She looked at me then, eyes meeting mine fully, and there was a vulnerability there that demanded a response. I didn't know how to speak, so I reached out, lightly resting a hand over hers. It wasn't bold or intrusive, just a simple gesture of connection, but seemed to convey more than words could. The subtle heat of her palm, the faint pulse beneath her skin, the way her gaze softened, all made my chest tighten in ways I hadn't anticipated. We stayed that way for a long while, hands touching, eyes locked, letting silence carry the weight of our emotions. Every small motion, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale, the gentle brush of her hair from her face, felt electric, a language all its own. In the quiet of that rainy afternoon, the emotional intimacy between us grew undeniable, layered with subtle tension and the delicate promise of something more. By the time the rain slowed, we had moved closer together, sitting side by side, shoulders nearly touching. There was no rush, no words forcing a revelation, just a profound understanding that we were beginning to inhabit the same emotional space. That day, I left not with answers or resolutions, but with a sense of anticipation and a quiet, simmering knowledge that our connection had deepened irreversibly. Days turned into weeks, and the quiet tension between us had grown into something palpable, an undercurrent in every glance, every brush of hands, every lingering smile. Each visit felt heavier than the last, charged with a quiet electricity I couldn't ignore. And yet, every step forward came shadowed by doubt, hesitation, and the gnawing awareness of the boundaries we weren't meant to cross. I found myself constantly replaying our interactions in my mind. Her soft laugh, the tilt of her head when she listened intently, the way her fingers occasionally brushed against mine. It was all simple, innocuous on the surface, yet it left my chest tight, my pulse quickened, my thoughts scattered. I struggled with the pull between desire and reason. She was my friend's mother, older, wiser, and carrying a life experience I could barely begin to grasp. But my heart didn't heed caution. It only noticed the warmth in her gaze, the subtle brush of her hand, and the gentle rhythm of her presence that seemed to anchor me in ways I hadn't known I needed. For her part, I sensed a similar struggle. She would sometimes pause mid-sentence, her eyes lingering on me longer than necessary, a flicker of something unreadable passing across her features. There were moments when our fingers touched accidentally, and the air would seem to hum with unspoken acknowledgement. And yet, always, she maintained a careful restraint, a quiet control that reminded me of the distance we weren't supposed to breach. One evening, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen again. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the soft glow above the counter. She was preparing something small, and I offered to help, an excuse to stay, to be near her. As I handed her a utensil, our fingers brushed, lingering just a heartbeat too long. My chest tightened. I caught her glance, and I thought I saw a flicker of hesitation mirrored in her eyes. It was as if we both recognized the depth of the connection, but feared its consequences. I sometimes wonder if I shouldn't feel this way. I admitted softly, almost to myself. The words trembled, fragile, but somehow she heard them. Her lips parted slightly, and she exhaled in a way that was almost a whisper. "I know," she replied quietly. "I think about it too. More than I probably should." Her voice was low, almost vulnerable, and my heart clenched at the admission. For a moment, time seemed suspended. We stood there, close enough to feel each other's presence, far enough to respect the unspoken boundary. The tension between us was electric, layered with desire, caution, and an aching awareness of what we couldn't fully allow ourselves to feel. And yet, in that charged silence, there was an unspoken understanding, a recognition that our hearts were aligned in ways that logic couldn't contain. When I finally left that evening, the weight of the unspoken lingered with me. The pull toward her had never felt stronger, nor the awareness of the complications more pressing. I realized that our connection was no longer just curiosity or admiration. It was something real, something that demanded honesty, courage, and patience. And yet, the conflict remained, a quiet ache that made every future encounter both thrilling and terrifying. It was a calm evening, the kind that made the world feel softer, slower, and more intimate. The sun was just beginning to set, spilling a golden glow through the living room windows, casting long, warm streaks of light across the furniture. I had come over under the pretense of helping with something small, but the truth was simpler. I didn't want to leave. Not yet. Not when the air between us carried the quiet weight of weeks of unspoken tension, lingering glances, and touches that spoke louder than words. She was sitting on the couch, a throw draped across her lap, a book resting on her knee. When she looked up and saw me, her smile was gentle, almost tender, and it carried with it a sense of relief, of shared understanding. "I'm glad you stayed," she said softly, her voice like a warm melody that filled the space between us. We settled into the couch together, sitting close but not in a rush, shoulders brushing, the occasional accidental touch of hands, fingers grazing just long enough to send shivers down my spine. The tension from before had softened into something quieter, deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement that what had been growing between us could exist without words. The room was filled with small gestures that felt monumental. I handed her a cup of tea, and our fingers lingered in contact, sharing the subtle warmth that went beyond the physical. She adjusted the throw over both of our laps, brushing my arm lightly in the process. It was effortless and natural, yet it made my heart pound in a way I couldn't ignore. We talked, but not in the hurried, careful way of before. Now, our words were slow, deliberate, intimate in their simplicity. She told me about memories from her youth, little stories she had never shared with anyone else. I shared thoughts and feelings I had kept to myself, vulnerable in a way that felt safe in her presence. There was no judgment, no hesitation, only the steady rhythm of two people truly seeing one another, connecting without barriers. At one point, she leaned her head lightly against my shoulder. I felt the warmth of her hair against my chest, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, and the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat. It was grounding, reassuring, and intimate without a single word spoken. I rested my hand gently over hers, fingers intertwining naturally, savoring the comfort and trust that had been building between us all this time. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, watching the sunset slowly fade into evening, the world outside muted and distant. Each glance, each touch, each quiet laugh strengthened the bond that had begun so subtly, so delicately weeks before. There was no rush, no need to define everything, just the warmth of being together, the quiet acceptance of feelings that had grown deep and undeniable. When it was time for me to leave, there was no urgency, no heartbreak. Instead, we shared a lingering look, a small, knowing smile, and a quiet acknowledgement that this was only the beginning of something meaningful. The tension had transformed into trust, desire into gentle affection, and uncertainty into a steady, warm connection. As I walked out, I knew with absolute certainty that our bond was real, tender, and lasting, a slow-burn romance that had found its first perfect moment of fulfillment.